Ooh, hello, everyone. Thank you, Rob, for the introduction. And it's actually nice to see you because I'm following you, reading your tweets. So it's like, I think it's first or second time I can see on the screen. And today we're going to talk about complicated topic of unit testing. I will quickly reintroduce myself. As Rob mentioned, I'm core team member of Vue.js. I work mostly on the documentation, but since we already had a talk about docs today from Evan, I will focus on a different topic. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, but most importantly for this talk, I'm a staff frontend engineer at GitLab. And as you don't know, GitLab is written with Vue on the frontend side. I'm also a maintainer, which means that I am doing daily reviews of the code. And I'm the one who merges this code to master branch and breaks master sometimes. This happens. As you can see, my daily work consists, maybe 50% of it consists of code reviews. And I noticed over time that 80% of my commands and merge requests are in unit tests. And I thought that if a team of dedicated developers following the same guidelines, we have written guidelines on testing as well, is doing the same mistakes over time on unit tests, what's going on in the community on this topic? From my experience, unit testing is something that is not documented clearly anywhere. The guidelines are very vague, and people are doing their tests in all the possible ways. So, hence this talk. To be clear, today we will be focusing on Vue test utils with Jest Runner. So we're not covering Cypress components. This will be covered tomorrow, from what I remember. We're not covering end-to-end testing or anything else. This talk is clearly about unit tests with Jest and VTU. Some of examples are specific to Vue 2. Most of them will be working with Vue 3, but I believe that not all and everyone are using Vue 3 yet. So it's good to cover some cases that you can see in Vue 2 code bases. So let's start with the practices to improve your unit tests. And first, probably the most important one is understand what are you testing and structure your test accordingly. How to understand what to test when you are trying to write a test for Vue component. We need to test the component output. And what is the component output for Vue SFC? First, most of the cases, it's rendered template. Your component renders HTML, and this HTML is the most important output of the component. Outside of the template, we also emit events. All emitted events to parent is also the component output. And side effects. This can be Vuex actions, can be rotor actions. We can call any kind of imported functions. Like, for example, at GitLab, we're calling create flash for our alerts or something like this. So all the side effects that component has are also considered to be component output. And at GitLab, when I joined, we had almost all tests structured like this. Describe methods, and then we're testing every single method in isolation. Describe computed properties, describe template. So this follows the inner structure of Vue single file component. But it's not following the output. This structure is very wrong. While you can easily compare it to the code, you will be not testing the output. You will be testing internals. We will touch it a bit later in the talk. So let's take a look at this template. It's very simple one where you have some kind of a loading state inside your component. And whenever loading is not there, you can have some data or maybe an error. Basically, this structure you can see in any component that deals with synchronously fetching data from the backend. And while you're structuring your test, you can think about maybe finite state machine in this case. It's not complete finite state machine, but you can think in terms of there is a loading state. Let's describe for loading. because it will be rendering loading text. It does not render error message, and it does not render data. And for this, you can write a complementary describe. So when there is an error, when there is data, when there are some maybe additional corner cases. When you write this test, it's very easy to read and follow as a reviewer. And for you, it basically is a spec, not just the test spec, but a specification of your component. When you're writing this kind of a structure, for me at least, it's the moment when I discover gaps in my component. Like, yeah, it should be rendering loading text. For some reason, my test fails, and then I go back to the component, and actually there is a mistake in the component. When you're following this structure, it gives your test a nice flow, let's say so. So, okay, you have this structure in mind, you can write to-dos, and then you're gonna start with component factory. What is component factory in this particular case? It's a function that allows you to mount or shallow mount your component. And it's a function where you can pass parameters and use it. Again, this is a common structure of the test for GitLab. So first you define a wrapper, and this is let. And then in every single test case, you will be just running create component. And of course, you will have an after each where you're destroying this wrapper. Why? Why cannot we just create a wrapper, maybe const wrapper in every single case? Well, you can imagine that there is a case where you shallow mounting and you have a props data with the user. And in different cases, like you have some stubs and mocks and everything. And then you create a wrapper where you have props data that are completely different. So first of all, this is boilerplate. And when every single time you write this wrapper with shallow mount, you create lots of boilerplate. Second, again, it's hard to follow and hard to understand what exactly you're testing and what are all the cases for the component. When you have a factory, you're just passing properties, arguments to this factory, and you can tweak it for your test cases. Third is use helpers to find elements and components. This is especially useful for the cases when you have a large test ensued, maybe for a big component. What are helpers to find elements and components in your unit test? These are simple functions that you usually define in the root describe after let wrapper. And these are functions that go with wrapper, find with identifier, or maybe find component model, or maybe it's something else. Usually we have around like 5, maybe 10 of these helpers. And we use them in all the tests instead of having wrapper, find, model. Why? Well, first of all, again, this is about boilerplate. This finder is quite simple and it's easy to follow. But with data test ID or maybe some more complicated things, so for example, when you're doing find all or find all components, and then you select the first element, it's just easier to say, find first item. And then you do this complex helper. And second, it really, really helps with refactoring. Imagine that you had this kind of a template. So there is a button with test ID create button with just a create text. Okay, if you're using DOM testing library, you can do find by text, but if you're using just clear Vue test utils, imagine that you did a refactoring and now it's not a button, but GL button component. If your test is big, in all the test cases, you're going to go through them and change your finder. If you have a dedicated finder on top of your file, you only replace it with maybe like find component GL button instead of searching by data test ID. So it's quite easy to do, and these helpers saved us lots of time when doing any kind of test refactoring. Next one, which is my absolute favorite, and like this is 80% of the 80% of all the commands. Do not test component internals. I'm seeing it so many times in guides, articles, code, GitLab's code base, other code bases. And what is component internals and how do you see that you're testing them in your test? Imagine you have Vue component with like some counter 0 and simple computed that returns this count multiplied by 2 and a method that just increments your count. And the test would be written like this. So you create a component, you set a data count to 1, and you expect wrapper.vm.double to be 2. Or you're spying on the method. From what I remember, this is not possible in Vue 3 and compatible Vue test utils, but it was a thing in Vue 2 and Vue test utils. So you click on the button and you spy if the method is called. And then you check if count is, okay, this is not incremented, but it should be like incremented. And this is a problem. Why? When you click on the button, you shouldn't be checking that the method is called. In this particular case, you're testing the framework. The framework ensures that click listener is calling the correct method. And you shouldn't be checking any kind of inner properties, not data, not computed, neither a method. This is incorrect way of testing anything. I heard many arguments about, but we should be testing computed in isolation. The thing is, isolation doesn't exist in SFC. Your computed should be rendered somehow and should affect the rendered template. If this computed is not in the template, maybe some kind of computers that use this computed are on the template. And you can check them all with a rendered template. So let's imagine that our template looks kind of like this. So we render a count with a data test ID count. We have a button that when we click, we increment this count, and we have some text with data test ID double, where we're actually rendering the double. So instead of checking wrapper.vm properties in your tests, let's go with checking the template. So we have this kind of find double helper. And the test for computed would be looking like this. It calculates double correctly. We create a component where count is 1, and then we expect the text of data test ID double to be count equals 2. The main difference here, you do nothing with a template. You only check the output. Or yeah, you can, for extended version, if you like to add some corner cases, maybe you can create a table with each and then provide a nice set of data and check again the nice set of outputs. But you will be still checking the text in the template. For data and methods, we can check like this. So we're creating a component and checking if the context is 0. Then we're clicking the button and we check that the count is changed to 1. We do not check if the method is triggered. We know it is. Otherwise, context won't be changed, right? In this particular case, we don't really care about the method and how it's called and if it's called. We only care that whenever I click the button, the text is changed. A few rules of thumb here, like how to see if you're checking it correctly. First of all, forget about asserting wrapper.vm. Wrapper.vm represents component internals. There are some cases when you need them. For example, when you want to emit an event, so wrapper.vm $emit, especially for child components. But generally, you shouldn't be asserting them in your expectations in the test. Second, this is again for Vue to do not spy on methods. Do not check if methods are called. And general rule of thumb that I really like. If you go to your component and change the name of method or computed property, your test should pass. Because output doesn't care of how the method or component or computed is called. Your output only cares about the value that is there. So try to rename them and see if your test is still passing. Why? why shouldn't we test component internals? Why cannot we rely on these isolated tests? Simple example. This is our template we were just checking in our test. And there is context to double. So imagine if for some reason I, as a developer, maybe I'm tired, maybe it's Friday, maybe I just missed something, and instead of putting double here, I put count. I'm mistaken. And in my test, if I write a test with isolation for my wrapper.vm.double, this test will pass because double is still 2, right? It's completely passing. But if I check the rendered template, my test will fail, and it should fail. This test should not pass. When you're testing component internals, you are really prone to false positives. The test will be passing, component would be wrong. That's why it's very important to pay attention to this part. Next step that kind of goes from the previous one is following the user. What is following the user in your tests? Let's come back to our template. So here is our familiar counter, button, and computed for double. And then we want to check that whenever we increase the count, we want to make sure that we increase in the double. So we are creating the component, checking the text is correct, and then we go with wrapper.vm count to, because we want to change the data, right? No. This is wrong. And unfortunately, Vue test utils for Vue 2 do not throw an error here when they should, because we are modifying wrapper.vm property here directly. This is very wrong. You should never modify wrapper.vm after wrapper is already created. There is a better way to do this in Vue test utils. This is like legit one. You can set data. You can change the data in the component and set the count to 2. This is better, but still not correct. Because in your component, data never changes without the interaction. Like, even if you're testing the watcher, data is changed after some kind of user action. And in our particular case, this action is clicking on increment button. So instead of setting data in your test, find out how this data is changed. Maybe it's clicking the button. For vModel, maybe it's setting the value of the input field. I remember that Vue test utils have a helper set value for the input. Set the value there. Your data will be modified, and then you will be able to check the rendered output. Follow the user actions. User modifies the data with some things that are happening on the template again. So rule of thumb here is do not change wrapper.vm directly. Next one is holy war. Treat child components as black boxes. There is a large holy war, but we're following Lord of the Rings memes here, so about mount and shallow mount. There is the whole school of testing that insists of mounting the whole component tree and then checking the output there like HTML, like fully rendered template. From my experience, this is not the best approach, especially if you are using component library and especially if you have deep nesting in your components. As an example, we are using Bootstrap Vue in the code base, and we were mounting components for tests. And then with updating the library, we just updated the Bootstrap Vue from one version to another, and all our tests were failing, where it shouldn't be. Because somewhere deep in the rendered tree, one attribute changes the name. From my experience, it's always better to treat the child component as a black box, and that's why we're following shallow mount. Shallow mount only mounts the component you're testing, and it just stubs all the child components in this particular case. So imagine that we have also a child component with a slot child component button, where we're passing double as a test prop, and when we are clicking it, we call onChildButtonClick method that increments child counter. So what is the black box my button? what are the component contracts in this particular case? We want to make sure that we are passing a correct prop there, only props. We don't care about what child component renders. We're checking props. And we want to make sure that whenever my button emits an event, we're doing something that we should be doing. So in this particular case, first we check props, if props are 10. And second, when we emit click, we want to make sure that child counter text changed. So if you have a child component in your test, make sure that props are correct, make sure that emitted events are handled properly, and then forget about it. Because whatever should be changed about the child component should go to the child component unit test. Again, this is a holy war question, and you might be following a different approach with mount. From my experience, shallow mount does better in this particular case. And the last one that was popping in all these examples, do not forget about Vue microtasks. Again, this is a very common thing when people start moving from modifying anything directly to following the user. Because whenever you emit this event from the child component, if you forget about the next tick in your test, if you just remove this part, this expectation will fail. Because Vue requires this little tick to update the rendered template. If you were asserting wrapper.vm, so for example, if I remove next tick here, but I will just write an expectation as wrapper.vm.child counter is 2, it will be 2. But it requires this tick to change the template. So this is something to have in mind when you start complaining that my test is failing now. This is basically it for 20 minutes. I wish I could have time for some live coding, but not today. And thank you for listening.